Thank you all for coming, and we are fortunate to have with us our distinguished guests, Peter Kuznick from American University and Steve Starr from everywhere, and the Los Alamos Study Group. Peter is a professor of history, and he has founded and directs the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, and is a frequent commenter internationally and otherwise, teaches really cool classes at AU on nuclear culture and other stuff, and is as a friend of ours. Steve Starr is a great nuclear scholar, former chair of the Clinical Studies Department at the University of Missouri. He ran a very influential website called nucleardarkness.org about nuclear winter and nuclear weapons effects generally. He had a great calculator until Google priced him out. He has migrated that website to nuclearfamine.org, which is recommended, and is the recent author of a book on the neglected phenomenon of high energy nuclear weapon-induced electromagnetic pulse and its effects on the electrical grid and on nuclear power plants specifically. And so we're very fortunate to have both of these distinguished guests with us here. Another thing that we all have in common is that we have been following events, the development or devolution of U.S. Russian relations very closely for now a decade, and I'm sure in all of our cases longer than that.
Greg, I'm just going to move this mic because you're not coming across very well because you're not directly in it.
Okay. So the general plan of the evening, I have written a number of questions and themes, too much for one evening, because we are coming from a place of darkness in our popular discourse about U.S.-Russian relations. So when you start writing down the questions that are pertinent, there's way too many for anything but a book-length treatment or a week-long meeting. But we'll get started, and Peter is going to lead us off, and then comes Stephen, and I will clean up, and we will also have, perhaps if there are very brief interventions, we'll do that. So the theory would be that Peter would speak, and then when Peter's done, then we'll have some questions from the audience and comments, and then Stephen, then questions and comments from the audience, and then me, and then we'll have, at the end we'll have questions and comments generally. Let's try to, all of us, speakers and audience alike, will all try to be very concise because of the large amount of material to go through. But please do ask questions. They're going to be great questions, no matter if you have any shyness or anything, don't worry about that. We're all beginners. And I mean, everything's happening so fast that truths of yesterday are not necessarily true today. So with that, we'd like to welcome Peter Kuznick. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. How many people do we have with us today?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And I'm trying to get it to where you can see them all.
Okay.
Well, that's okay, because I'm looking at my notes that I have up here on the screen, so I can't see them anyway.
Okay.
and that's because when Greg invited me to do this, it was a few weeks ago, and I thought, wow, that's a great idea, and it gives me lots of time to think about it and prepare. Well, as I was trying to do that today, in between interviews about the Israeli-Iran situation and China and Taiwan, and other things that are going on, I realized that this is an overwhelming topic, and it's going to take me weeks more to get my mind around. So what I'm going to give today is going to be embarrassingly disjointed. And, I've got several different sets of notes that I'm going to refer to. But I actually wrote out an introduction, which I haven't had a chance to look at since I wrote it. But let me read this to you, and then we'll get into some of the history. Now, first I should explain, Greg really wanted to focus on the post-Cold War period, but as a historian, I can't do that. For me to make sense out of the post-Cold War period, I have to look at the Cold War. And in order to make sense out of the Cold War, I've got to look at the 19th century. So I'm going to do is run through a lot of stuff. What I'd written was, never having been asked before to give a talk about Russophobia, although I've given countless talks, lectures, and interviews about the tensions and outright enmity between the U.S. and NATO and the Soviet Union and later Russia, I've had to think seriously about the difference between Russophobia and criticism of Russia. I consider myself a friend of Russia, but a highly critical one. There's much that I deplore about Russian history and contemporary Russia. I had written extensively about Russia, but never visited Russia until 2015. And then I returned 6 more times before COVID struck in 2019. I brought almost 30 students there for annual Victory Day commemorations between 2016 and 2018. Their airfare and expenses were covered by the International Association of Peace Foundations. I do more than 100 interviews a year on Russian TV, in addition to others with Russian print media. My critics dismiss me as a useful idiot for advocating better relations between the U.S. and Russia, just as I dismiss them as useless warmongers for demonizing Russia and preferring a constant state of nuclear-armed belligerence. My friend and collaborator, Oliver Stone, spent 20 hours with Putin in filming the Putin interviews, and Putin proudly showed him a copy of our book, the Russian version of the Untold History of the United States that Putin had on his desk, and Putin said that he loved it and learned a lot from it, despite the fact that we received our first blurb from Mikhail Gorbachev. But that doesn't mean that I support the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I think was provoked or wrong-headed, nor that I like the crackdown on free speech inside Russia since 2022, which critics of the war face jail time and protests are all but banned, nor do I countenance Russian homophobia, though the phenomenon is not as pervasive as reported in the West, or resurgent Christian nationalism, which often involves turning a blind eye or outwardly supporting far-right movements in countries like France, Germany, and the U.S. The challenge for American progressives is to differentiate between legitimate criticisms of Russia and blind hatred for all things Russian and/or paranoia about Russian intentions to recreate its fallen empire or to conquer the world, a fear that has been rekindled with the advent of the new Cold War and the growing Russian friendship with China and other nations. So one of the interesting quotes that I came across a few minutes ago, or recall, was a statement by George Will in 1996. George Will, the conservative columnist, who said that, quote, expansionism is in the Russians' DNA. This idea about demonizing Russia in general and demonizing Putin in particular is not only wrong-headed, but it's so dangerous, especially at this moment in history. A moment in history where we're on the verge of war, not only world war I'm talking about, potential nuclear war, not only over Ukraine, but in the Middle East right now, between Israel and Iran, and that exploding into a full-scale regional war, and over China and Taiwan. But Greg wanted us to focus today about Russophobia, not Sinophobia or Iranophobia. So I'll talk about Russia. One of the earliest to warn about the challenge posed by Russia was Secretary of State William Henry Seward, who in 1861 explained Russia was an early and has always been a constant friend. And he says that Russia and the U.S. may remain good friends until each, having made a circuit of half the globe in opposite directions, shall meet each other in the region where civilization first began. And then he said, all bets are off, and our friendship is going to end, and we're going to have this conflict. But even before that, in 1835, the French visitor, Alexis de Tocqueville, came to the United States and wrote the book, Democracy in America. And there, in 1835, he says, there are, at the present time, two great nations in the world which started from different points but seem to tend toward the same end. I allude to the Russians and Americans. Both of them have grown up unnoticed, and whilst the attention of mankind was directed elsewhere, they have suddenly placed themselves in the front rank among the nations of the world, and the world learned their existence and their greatness at almost the same time. He goes on to say, talks about their conquests and their differences. And he says their starting point is different, and their courses are not the same. Each of them seems marked out by the will of heaven to sway the destinies of half the globe. Well, we might say that Russia's role as swaying the destiny of half the globe has been eclipsed of late by China, which the U.S. now says is the pacing threat. But it was in our national security doctrine in 2018 that Mattis and Trump said that the pacing threat, the real threat now, is no longer international terrorism, it's Russia and China. But this is in 2018. The U.S. first intervened in Russia 100 years before that, in 1918. Following the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the U.S. sent 15,000 troops into Russia to join 40,000 British troops, tens of thousands more from Japan, France, and other countries to intervene again to support the conservative white Russians against the Russian Revolution. Churchill and Marshall Falk wanted to go further, and they implored Wilson to join an intervention to overthrow the Bolsheviks, who Churchill said should be strangled in the cradle. But the U.S. troops were there, mostly to limit German and Japanese inroads, and we didn't go along with the extreme version, but there were progressives in the United States who recoiled at U.S. military intervention in the Soviet Union in 1918, 1919, and 1920. And in fact, Hiram Johnson, the senator from California, introduced a resolution into the Senate to stop U.S. funding for the American troops there. And it deadlocked at 33 to 33 in the Senate. And these progressives, Hiram Johnson, James Vardaman, William Morrow, Robert La Follette, and others, condemned this early American imperialism and attempt to thwart the Russian Revolution. The next step I want to mention comes about during the Depression. And because it was in 1928 that the Soviet Union embarked upon its first 5-year plan. And based on this 5-year plan, and the third period as it was called, when the Depression hit in the United States and across Europe at that point, if you read Business Week, and if you read Christian Science Monitor, and you read Nation and New Republic and New York Times, they were saying that the only country to have avoided the Depression was the Soviet Union. That the Soviet economy was thriving while the capitalist economies were in a state of collapse. And in fact, in 1931, Amtorg, the Soviet trading agency, announced that they were going to be recruiting a small number of American workers to go work in the Soviet Union. And the next day, the Amtorg offices were swamped with tens of thousands of Americans who desperately wanted to go to the Soviet Union to find work. But it was also this time that the Soviet experiment was, at a time when American capitalism was collapsing, captured the imagination of American progressives and left-wingers. And there are a lot of people I could cite in that way. But as New Republic literary editor Edmund Wilson visited the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and he said, "I felt as if I were at the moral top of the universe, where the light never really goes out." Stuart Chase, the economist, said that for Russians, the world is exciting, stimulating, challenging, calling forth interest and enthusiasm. The world for most Americans is dull and uninspiring, racked with frightful economic insecurity. And then Chase asked the next year, why should Russians have all the fun of remaking the world? During this decade, the Russian experiment excited American intellectuals. And the group that was most excited were the American scientists, because the Soviet 5-year plan was grounded in science and technology. And so it wasn't until the end of the decade that they began to realize the extent of Stalinist repression, the extent of scientists, number of scientists who were disappearing, the hardship that people were facing. But before that point, the Soviet Union inspired Americans who were looking for alternatives. The next step that I wanted to talk about in my disjointed presentation, and I hope you're able to keep up and make some sense out of this, is during World War II. During World War II, the alliance between the U.S. and the Russians, the U.S. and the Soviets, was in the forefront of America's, of the world's ability to defeat fascism. Now I'm looking for my quotes, and of course I can't find them here, but if you look at the comments made by Ralph Parker and Orville Prescott in the New York Times, they talk about the extraordinary heroism of the Russian people. Parker said, if I could recall it, that it would take a Tolstoy to write about the heroism of the Russians. Orville Prescott, the main book reviewer in the New York Times, said that we owe the fact that we're not living in slavery, that we won't live in slavery to the Nazis, to the heroic stand of the Russian people. So the Americans, many Americans, appreciated Russian heroism, as did Roosevelt. And Roosevelt realized that it was the Russians who were doing most of the fighting. I would go into a lot more detail, but I think we don't have, I'll run out of time. Let me just say that in recent surveys, 17% of Europeans credit the Soviet Union with playing a major role in defeating Nazi Germany. Only 7% of the French do. Americans know very, very little history, as we always bemoan the fact. As Joe and I said, one of the charming things about Americans is they have absolutely no historical memory. And what I did an anonymous survey with college students, all of whom were A students in high school, and I asked them how many Americans died in World War II. The median answer I got was 90,000. So they were only about 300,000 off. I asked them how many Soviets died in World War II. The median answer I got was 100,000. So they were only 27 million off, which means they have no understanding of Russian history, of World War II, of the Cold War, of what's going on in Ukraine now. It's impossible without knowing this history. But the things I want to mention to you, and there's a lot that I would say if I had more time, is that throughout most of World War II, the Americans and the British confronted 10 German divisions between us, while the Soviets were on their own confronting more than 200 German divisions. The Germans lost 1 million on the Western Front and 6 or 7 million on the Eastern Front. No wonder even Churchill said the Red Army tore the guts out of the German war machine. But that's the history that's forgotten. That's not known. What should be known, we have coming up in another week or so, a little more than a week, is another commemoration of the meeting of the American and the Soviet troops at the Elbe River on April 25th, April 26th. And we're planning a commemoration for that. Franklin Roosevelt's last telegram that he sent to Churchill before he died on April 12th, 1945, a day that will really live in infamy, Roosevelt said, these issues between us and the Russians pop up all the time and they all seem to get resolved. We should not make a big deal about them. We should work together in friendship with the Russians after the war. However, the sad fact was that Harry Truman became president on April 12, 1945, and not Henry Wallace. And that's one of the tragedies of history. Wallace, who was considered a great friend of the Soviets, Wallace went on the day that the Democratic Party convention began, July 20th, 1944, Gallup released a poll asking potential voters who they wanted on the ticket as vice president. 65% of American voters said they wanted Henry Wallace back as vice president. 2% said they wanted Harry Truman. The tragedy is that the party bosses who controlled the convention forced Truman as the vice presidential nominee. And unlike Wallace, Truman had no idea and no trust and no friendship, no friendly feelings toward the Soviets. So the Soviet Union was devastated after the war. And they really were counting on U.S. friendship and U.S. aid. Roosevelt had promised $20 million in reparations after the war, half of which would go to the Soviet Union, which Stalin desperately wanted. So after the war, Stalin creates a buffer zone around the Soviet Union. He wanted friendly governments because the Soviets had been invaded twice within the past 25 years by the Germans, and he wanted this buffer zone. He did not impose lockstep governments, Soviet-style governments. That didn't happen. And Wallace kept warning, and he kept telling Truman that, he says, look at how what we're doing looks to the Soviets. How would we feel if they had a monopoly of atomic bombs and we did not? How would they feel if we were setting up military bases around the world from which we had bombers that could bomb the Soviet Union? How would we feel if it was the opposite? How would we feel if they were vastly increasing their military spending and 85% of their spending was going toward the military? But Wallace's efforts were thwarted. He stayed on as Secretary of Commerce after being Vice President because Roosevelt begged him to. But then when he criticized Truman's warmongering policies, Cold War policies, nuclear arms policies, and finally on September 20th, 1946, Truman fires Wallace, and the last of the old New Dealers was gone from the administration. At that point, Truman embarks upon much more aggressive Cold War policies. When he implements, when he's about to take over for the Brits in Greece and in Turkey in 1947 with his Truman Doctrine, Senator Arthur Vandenberg, Republican from Michigan, tells him, if you want to get this through Congress, you're going to have to scare the hell out of the American people. Says you're going to have to scare the hell out of the country. And we begin from that point on with this notion of threat inflation, which we're going to see over and over and over again. Part of the demonization, part of the endemization of Russia deals with this idea of threat inflation. And we're going to see it repeatedly. For example, NSC 68, which was introduced before the Korean War and by Paul Nitze, and nobody thought it had a chance. What NSC 68 called for was a quadrupling of American military spending, with the idea that what we have to prepare against is not what the Soviets are likely to do, not what they're rationally planning to do, but what they're capable of doing in a worst-case scenario. And so it called for quadrupling American military spending, from $12 billion a year to $50 million a year, $50 billion a year. And that's what, with the Korean War, they finally were able to get that through. And so, but there was still chances to roll this back, this insanity. On March 5th, 1953, Joseph Stalin dies. And Malenkov and Khrushchev and the Russian leaders reach out, send out an olive branch to the American leaders. The new administration under Eisenhower and Dulles, they say that we should end the Cold War effectively and begin to work together to create peace, is what the Soviet leaders were saying. And Eisenhower makes a great speech condemning militarism, but the next day, Dulles, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, comes out and accuses the Russians of trying to take over the world. So, again, the hopes were dashed. The next time we have an important incident, really, that we can talk about a lot, but in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. And the Soviets also test their first intercontinental ballistic missile. And some Americans freak out. Eisenhower tried to tamp down the fear. In fact, the week after the Soviets launched Sputnik, Eisenhower says, oh, it's only one small ball in the atmosphere. And he went out and he played 5 rounds of golf that week to show the American people he wasn't worried. However, the Washington Post, they organized the Gaither Committee. Gaither Committee issues a report. The Washington Post summarizes it and says, the United States is facing the greatest threat in its history. The Soviets are now preparing to effectively wipe the United States out with their intercontinental ballistic missiles. And Kennedy and the Democrats and Johnson run on the basis of this missile gap, which doesn't exist, as we know. And the first thing that McNamara, when Kennedy gets in there, McNamara says is, let's figure out what the reality is, and he immediately reports there is no missile gap. Then Roswell Gilpatrick reports in, I think it was September, a speech actually written by our friend Dan Ellsberg. And he says that not only was there a missile gap, which won in all categories of weaponry, but at that point, the Joint Chiefs, the Strategic Air Command, was asking for the United States to build 10,000 more intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Joint Chiefs, the Air Force wanted 3,000 more, and McNamara decides the lowest number he can get away with is 1,000 more. Well, the Soviets had 4 ICBMs at the time. How did this look to them when the United States announced its plan to build 1,000 more? The Soviets interpret that as if the U.S. is preparing for a first strike against the Soviet Union. Why do they put the missiles in Cuba? Well, to protect against a planned U.S. invasion to overthrow Castro and to try to rebalance the American great superiority in nuclear weaponry. I would love to talk about John Kennedy's extraordinary American University commencement address, where he talks about the need for an enlightened attitude and friendship toward the Soviet Union, where he talks about how terrible it is that we've got such mistrust toward each other. I'm just going to mention a few of the things that I would talk about if I had more time. My students, I usually teach for 2.5 hours, so I've got a lot more time. I don't have that much time tonight. I will talk about Team B in 1976. who went in there and challenged the CIA's interpretations of Soviet intentions and painted this horrific picture about how the Soviets are out to conquer the world and how we've got to increase our military spending. I would talk about what Brzezinski did as National Security Advisor under Carter to deliberately try to induce a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan by arming the Mujahideen. And why were the Mujahideen, who we were supporting, why were they so opposed to the pro-Soviet government in Kabul? Because this pro-Soviet government was educating women. And the people who we were supporting were going in there into the schools and skinning teachers alive because they were educating women. In addition to the advocacy of land reform and industrialization. And then with the Reagan administration, they come in there with more than 50 members of the Committee on the Present Danger. As Reagan says, we're in greater danger today than we were the day after Pearl Harbor. Our military is absolutely incapable of defending this country. And he calls the Russians an evil empire. And he revitalizes the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. By 1985, Reagan had increased military spending by 51% over the 1980 figure. We can look at this attitude about the Soviet Union. As John Gaddis said after watching CNN's 24-part Cold War history series talking about Soviet atrocities in 1998, he said, quote, "The Red Army rapes in Germany in 1945, the crushing of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, the suppression of the Prague Spring in 1968, the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the persecution of dissidents in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe throughout the Cold War." He says, most students, knowing this history, would reject the idea of a moral equivalence as laughable. Well, the Cold War was a disaster. As Gorbachev said, the Cold War made losers of us all. As Schlesinger said, Arthur Schlesinger said, looking back on this, people are going to marvel at the disproportion between the political stakes and the fact that we were risking ending life on the planet. The absurdity, the insanity of this all. So the Cold War ends. And what does the United States do? Immediately, George H.W. Bush praises Gorbachev's restraint throughout Eastern Europe. And what does the U.S. do? The U.S. sends 15,000 troops to join the 12,000 who are already in Panama to overthrow Noriega in December of 1989. The Organization of American States voted 20-1 to deeply deplore the invasion. Followed almost very, very quickly the next year by Gulf War I. Do you remember how many troops the United States had there for Operation Desert Storm in January of 1991? Almost 700,000 U.S. troops would serve in that operation. But what we need to get to, which I'm sure is more what Greg wanted us to talk about, is NATO expansion. And we know that Gorbachev was given assurances, not only by Bush, not only by Baker, not only by Genscher, not only by the Germans, not only by the Brits, he was given assurances by everybody that if they allowed the unification of Germany, NATO will not expand 1 inch to the east, 1 thumb's width to the east. And that was in 1990. Before the year was out, NATO began planning for expansion. They don't actually begin the expansion till 1999 with Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, but they were planning it from the very, very beginning, despite the warnings. And the warnings were not coming from the doves, they were coming from Cold Warriors. People like George Kennan, the architect of the Cold War. And people, I got a list of them here, which maybe later we could go through some of the comments. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Bill Bradley, the U.S. ambassador at the time, the ambassador under Reagan, Jack Matlock, the, the warnings were coming that if we did this, it was going to very likely end up in a war between Russia and NATO. And they were right, as we've seen, finally. But it was at this point that the U.S., after the collapse of the Soviet Union, took advantage. Charles Krauthammer, the leading neocon theorist, said in 1990, "This is America's unipolar moment." Said it'll likely last 30 to 40 years. Nobody can challenge us, so we can do whatever we want anywhere on the planet. And Russia was very weak in this period. And the Harvard and Columbia economists went in there and they worked with Yeltsin and his people, putting the Russian economy through shock therapy. I write about this, and Oliver and I write about this in Untold History, and we blame Jeffrey Sachs, who was the head of the Harvard team. And Jeffrey Sachs wrote to me, and he said, "Peter, you guys really put me through the ringer in Untold History." He said, "But I'm not as guilty as charged. They rejected all of my advice." Now Jeffrey's a good friend. He's a good friend, and we're working together to try to prevent this this insanity that's going on in terms of Russophobia and a war between the U.S. and the Russians. We can get into much more of that history.
So Peter, we should probably hold that thought right there, and let's maybe if we had a few questions right now, and then we'll have time to go to Steve and so you brought us almost up. But first, I want to also, I forgot to thank.
Greg, if I could just then skip ahead.
Okay.
Just mention a couple things. I want to mention that 1999 NATO bombing of the Serbs in Yugoslavia.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians and Chinese UN delegates told NATO leaders that they would oppose the use of force in the UN Security Council. At which point NATO launched what would be considered an illegal by UN international law bombing campaign against Yugoslavia that lasted 78 days, killed over 500 civilians, and 96% of the Russians considered it a crime against humanity. At that point, so what we've got then is that immediately following on the heels of NATO expansion in 1999, and as our friend Stephen Cohn wrote, these two actions revived the
Uh-oh. You're mute. You're muted, Derek.
He's frozen.
Frozen.
Greg, can you hear me?
Now I do.
Now
Yes.
we can.
Yes.
Okay, 81% of Russians saw this as hostile to Russian policy, even though they were trying to be friendly to the United States. Then after 9/11, Putin was the first international leader to reach out to the United States to offer aid. And then in 2002, after the invasion of Afghanistan, Krauthammer says that he was wrong in 1990. It's not the unipolar moment, it's the unipolar era, and it's going to last indefinitely. That the U.S. will have no opponents. But then in 2006, there is an article in Foreign Affairs, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, written by two theorists, Lieber and Press, and a very important article, and they say in 2006 that the United States has finally achieved a first strike capability against Russia and China, meaning that if the United States launches a nuclear attack against Russia and China, neither one will be able to respond at all. The Washington Post said it sent head spinning inside the Kremlin. Other comments at the time were that they took this to be official U.S. policy. And then in 2007, Putin issues his warnings in Munich at the Munich Security Conference about the dangers of unipolarity, about the dangers of American exceptionalism, that they've got to take Russia's interests into account. And then in 2008 is when George W. Bush says that we want to fast track Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. That was the red line, as William Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, wrote back at the time. He says, "Niet means niet. Don't cross Russia's red lines." He says, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite." And then we can draw the straight line, as I'm sure you and Steve are going to do now, from that to the Maidan coup in 2014, and the beginnings of what we're seeing that later develops into the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But as the article in Foreign Affairs Today that I shared with you and Steve showed, that in March of 2022, Putin was more than willing to end the fighting and have a compromise solution, but we treat him as we did, as even Matt Taibbi, progressive columnist, after the so-called Russiagate in 2016, Matt Taibbi called Putin a gangster, spook, scum of the lowest order, capable of anything, in an article in Rolling Stone. And that's the attitude, this excess demonization of Putin and of Russia, instead of looking clearly at what Putin represents, what Russia represents, what their interests are, what their goals are, and have a proportionate response to some of that. We are in la-la land, which is dangerous, so dangerous because we are on the verge of World War III and the possibility of nuclear wars. I'm sure you're going to talk about.
Thank you so much, Peter. And in that wonderful grand tour, I want to add something that I'm sure you would have said if you had 2 more seconds, but also very important was the U.S. withdrawal from the ABM treaty in 2002. It made an enormous impact in Russia, and Putin at the time said, "We can't possibly afford to follow you down the ABM path, so we will make more offensive weapons." And that's the path we're going to have to take.
And Greg, on March 1st, 2018, when Putin announces that Russia now has 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent U.S. missile defense, he traces that exactly back to 2002 and the abrogation of the ABM treaty. And now, as I'm sure we're going to mention, now the U.S. has abrogated every other treaty, the INF treaty, the Open Skies Treaty. Effectively now Russia's pulled out of the New START Treaty. There is no more nuclear arms control architecture between us,
Yes.
which is so mainly dangerous.
And also in that same grand tour, we've got when the U.S. failed to ratify the CTBT in 1999, and this comes back to our own precious little labs, the Russian ratification of START 2, which was a very favorable treaty to the United States, was conditioned on U.S. ratification of the CTBT. And when we failed to ratify the CTBT, we also trashed START 2. And so that was another one of those treaties. And that we did on the failed idea that we could, outcompete Russia and so forth. Now, before we go to Steve and me and all around, and Peter, you just jump in whenever you would like, I think we should have, are there comments, questions from the audience?
So, my name is Laura Dale. I'm a New Mexico native who's been working on indigenous sovereignty issues for a long, long time. And of course, that then leads to Palestine and Gaza and all of that sort of thing. I don't want to take us into that territory, but what I want to ask you about is in the process of researching for a documentary I'm working on called Killers of the Gaza Moon, which started out as taking the Osage oil massacres and layering them over the what's going on in Gaza. In the process of researching that, I just heard this recent news, and I would love to hear your take on it. There's a journalist in London who's saying, look at every explosive place on the coastline of the Levant right there,
Right.
which is all that contested oil waters. Every single place that's exploding right now, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Ukraine, all of that is also part of what has been talked about as the New Silk Road. So it just came on my radar. I'm curious if you've heard about it. I'd love to hear your take on it, because what I heard is that there's now a competition between China, Russia, and potentially Ukraine recreating the old Silk Road as, quote, the new Silk Road, and that Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and I think a couple of other countries are wanting to divert that off the coastline. So if you look up New Silk Road,
Yeah.
there's an alternative route,
Laura?
and I'm just curious about what your take is on that.
Quickly, thank you.
Yeah.
I answered you by email, right? Already? Any other comments? Well, I guess I'll let me just, there's a lot going on, and so it's, I think it's hard to pin down causality in a sharp kind of way.
Yeah.
And so, hang on to that question, and maybe what we do tonight will reflect on it.
I appreciate it. If you can't now, we'll just
Yeah.
give you my card. I would just love to hear your take on it.
Yep. Other questions? Okay, Steve, you want to take us into some other aspects of this?
Sure. Well, I'll pick up close to where Peter left off. You know, there was a mischance for peace when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. I believe there was a general expectation in Russia that this would pave the way for peace with the United States and an end to the danger of nuclear war. But instead, the United States chose to declare victory over Russia, and they moved to exploit this victory. They sent economists to oversee the privatization of the Soviet economy, which led to the greatest depression of the 20th century, and millions of Russians died there, left a very bad memory. Russia, though, then became more or less an afterthought to the U.S. political elite. We were pursuing our war on terror in the Middle East with our endless wars. But in 2007, Vladimir Putin gave a speech in Munich that kind of got everybody's attention when he protested NATO expansion and the placement of ballistic missile launchers in Romania and Poland. Peter mentioned, you know, the NATO expansion. I mean, that's been one of the key issues with Russia. Russia's security concerns have been minimized by the United States and NATO for decades now. And, you know, there's protests. In 2008, NATO basically told Georgia and Ukraine that they were going to make them part of NATO, and that was a major red line. You know, so after 2007, Vladimir Putin became very unpopular with the Western elite, and he's kind of progressively vilified. And this process continued and reached an extreme when Russia invaded Ukraine. You know, when the leaders of a nation decide to go to war with another nation, historically the common tactic is to first vilify the leader of the opposing nation and then move on to the entire population. You know, we saw this in World War I when the Kaiser was shown as a monster, and then not long after the German people were referred to as Huns. And any war, you know, we have the Japs and the Goots and you name it. But, you know, we saw after Russia invaded Ukraine, within a week or two, President Joe Biden called Vladimir Putin a pure thug and a murderous dictator. In a speech in Poland, he called for the removal of Putin from power. I mean, you know, I don't know if I've ever heard a Russian leader call for removal of an American president from power. Definitely not during the Cold War. And these kind of personal slurs make diplomacy almost impossible. And Biden hasn't spoken to Putin in more than 2 years, which is not really a comforting thought considering the extreme tensions that now exist between the U.S. and Russia. At the same time, when Biden and other Western political elites were personally insulting Putin in 2022, Western society began discriminating against all Russians. In Canada, Russian community center was vandalized. In England, the Cardiff Philharmonic banned Tchaikovsky from feature performances. In the United States, a Russian restaurant was vandalized in Washington, D.C. The Metropolitan Opera in New York City announced that a Russian opera singer had withdrawn from the company for not complying with the Met's condition that she repudiate her public support for Vladimir Putin. About this time, the Indian press reported a poll results that found Russophobia in the United States nears Cold War levels. 80% see Russia as the enemy. So this term Russophobia, which we're supposed to be talking about, is given to the anti-Russian sentiment in the West. In reality, it's a form of racism. Discrimination against an entire class or race leads to hatred and societal acts of violence. Such as the U.S. internment of 120,000 Japanese American citizens during World War II, or worse, the concentration camps of the Nazis. When Russia protested this discrimination, and they used the term Russophobia, a neocon think tank in Washington stated that, quote, the term Russophobia was popularized by Vladimir Putin in a bid to smear critics as irrational, unquote. So that's a kind of, devolves into that kind of dialogue. And I think that Russophobia was fostered by the FBI and CIA. There was Russiagate, which was the false accusation that Trump had committed treason by colluding with Putin. And it involved the FBI and the CIA promoting false intelligence to prevent Trump from becoming president, and then afterwards trying to cripple his presidency. There was Hunter Biden's laptop computer, which was held by the FBI, which withheld evidence of Biden's corruption before the presidential election. And 50 former intelligence officials, including 2 former directors of the CIA, stated that the laptop was, quote unquote, Russian disinformation. These are some of the worst examples. I'm sure you can think of more. And even in peacetime, I think all countries tend to promote news stories that are in line with the official narrative. But in times of war, any narratives that threaten the state are likely to be made illegal, and anybody that promotes those are punished. And so along with Russophobia came increasing censorship and attacks on freedom of the press in the United States and in Western Europe. And the biggest targets of governmental censorship in these situations tend to be those who disclose illegal activities to war crimes perpetrated by the state. And we have Julian Assange is probably one of the best examples. He exposed U.S. Army war crimes in Afghanistan. He's arrested on false charges. He's been held in prison. Now he's facing extradition in the United States, and for what? He's an Australian citizen, not a U.S. citizen. How could he have violated U.S. laws? But the point is, he's being made an example of for anyone who might dare to follow this example. Today, the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index ranks the United States as 48th in the world in terms of freedom of the press. So when Russia launched the Ukraine war, the news in Washington and the Western media quickly became an outlet for official narratives from Washington. Even the paper of record, the New York Times, they basically substituted war propaganda for news. The reports from the Ukraine military were uncritically accepted as truth, and anyone who chose to dispute their accuracy or truthfulness was soon labeled a Putin apologist. If you recall, Russia ran out of missiles and half their army was destroyed, and Biden announced, last August, that Russia is losing the war, Russia has lost the war. That doesn't seem to be the case today. I want to address one of the lies promoted in the West that still remains as conventional wisdom, and that is that the war in Ukraine was unprovoked aggression. If you look, you'll see that phrase is used constantly. And this started being used immediately after the Russian invasion in the EU, the White House, remarks by President Biden on Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine. It was President Joe Biden's major speech on the first-year anniversary of the war and NATO statements. The New York Times editorial pages have included at least 26 editorials and opinion columns and op-ed pieces that have described the Russian invasion as unprovoked. But it was provoked, and I wrote about this, and I took a lot of heat for it. I'm going to identify four main causes for the war. And as Peter mentioned, there was a NATO expansion to the Russian border, and also the placement of ballistic missile launch sites in Romania and Poland. This was just a red line that Russia, they had constantly said that they would not tolerate NATO in Ukraine, and that was one of their talking points in the draft treaties they gave to the U.S. in 2021, right before the war began. The rise in power in Ukraine of far-right neo-Nazi admirers for Stepan Bandera, while in the 2014 U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine, that was intolerable to. Russia, the Soviet Union lost 27 million people killed in World War II. That Victory Day is the largest secular holiday in Russia, and that's when they celebrate the victory over the Nazis. So seeing a neo-Nazi regime rise up in Ukraine on their border was something that was just almost unthinkable. And then after that, after the 2014 coup, almost immediately, Ukraine began what they called the anti-terrorist operation. That was right after John Brennan went to Kiev, and I think he helped label it that way to make it, saleable. But it was a civil war, and the Ukrainian army began attacking the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. And I wrote a piece for the Consortium News in March 2022. I referenced sources in the Donbass republics where they showed 18,000 civilians had been killed during the time period from 2014 through 2021. And this was not reported in the West. This is a form of censorship by omission. But when you keep your people uninformed about something like that, it makes it a lot easier to convince them that the Russians conducted an unprovoked aggression. Also, 5 days before the Russian invasion, Zelensky gave a speech in Munich. I covered that in my article too. And he made it clear that Ukraine would seek to obtain nuclear weapons, basically if Ukraine was not admitted to NATO. There was ample stores of Russia. So Greg asked me to talk about some of the effects of propaganda on anti-nuclear activists. And I think, so in my case, when I published that article in Consortium News, I was attacked for putting out fascist propaganda. I reported also on the U.S. biolabs that were present in Ukraine, which the Russian troops had overrun in the first stage of the war. And I mean, I was just literally just called out by a number of people on an e-group that I've been in for years, also people that I had worked with for years. Shortly thereafter, Victoria Nuland testified that Ukraine has biological research facilities, and if you go to the U.S. Embassy website, and Ukraine still has a webpage online entitled Biological Threat Reduction. It details various studies such as, quote, risk assessment of selected avian EDPs potentially carried by migratory birds over Ukraine. In other words, they're using migratory birds as a delivery system for pathogens. Those birds fly to Russia. They had work done to study the transmission of African swine fever virus, all sorts of things that you normally don't find in Ukraine. When I also reported on the development of hypersonic weapons in Russia, and which had far surpassed the United States. We lost that arms race. Russia's on their second and third generation of hypersonic weapons, and the U.S. has yet to develop even a working prototype. But I was accused by someone who teaches physics at the university level. He told me there were no Russian hypersonic weapons, and I was putting out Russian propaganda. When I reported on the increased shelling in Donbass immediately before the Russian invasion, that Ukraine had massed 60,000 troops on the Donbass border, and shelling increased 10 times over the worst that had been during the 8-year period preceding the war. This was called Russian propaganda. So I guess I think I'm going to leave a little time for Greg and to talk. But what I see today is that we have ideologues in power in the West, in the United States and in Europe, who they lie, and they're committed to confrontation with Russia. And they prosecuted a proxy war with Russia and Ukraine that's basically turned into a U.S. NATO war against Russia. It's recognized that way in Russia. That puts us in an extremely dangerous situation when Biden doesn't talk to Putin and all the other things you hear on the news are going on. So But if, Biden White House and the EU cannot accept defeat, then they will take us into a shooting war with Russia one of these days. So that is probably the worst danger we've had since the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think, and maybe in some ways worse. I wouldn't be giving a thought to it if I didn't have some hope that we could turn this around, because I think it's widely recognized around the world. It's just that the people in charge don't seem to get it. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg, and thank you for letting me make this intervention.
Thank you so much. Steve, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. I really, really appreciate those comments as well as Peter's. And before I try to fill in some of the gaps and see where this goes, other people have some questions or comments? Okay, Roberto. Yeah, careful of the cords.
Just careful of the cords.
Yeah.
Across here.
Hi, my name is Roberto. Thank you both for the really great presentations. My question is about U.S. media, because you several times y'all mentioned, how the U.S. public doesn't know this, doesn't know that. The Cuban Missile Crisis, people didn't know that the U.S. put missiles in Hungary, and that's why the Soviet Union put them in Cuba. People don't know that, we're cheering now because Iran shot all these missiles to Israel, and the U.S. and Israel knocked them all down. But people don't know that those missiles, that was just the old missiles that Iran has. And they were just making a point that they could still hit Israel. And their most sophisticated missiles, they're still sitting on those. And nobody realizes that. And what do we do about the U.S. media? And if you can explain that, you're my heroes.
Well, I think that for myself, I have to look for a lot of different news sources so I can hope to find at least some idea of what's going on. I like to listen to some of there's a website called the Duran, there's Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou. They talk on that and they have their own blogs. There's a guy named Brian Berlechtic who has a website called the New Atlas. And he's very good at reporting, particularly in military issues. But one thing you can do is you can get a Google Translate or a different translate software on your web browser, and you can go to websites all around the world, but in Russia, for example, and you can look at their news, and the translator will translate that for you automatically. It's a really good way to get a different perspective. I also use Yandex, which is actually a Russian browser, because Google is another form of censorship. News they don't want to have promoted, they bury it on like page 14 of your search. And I have to go to Yandex sometimes to look up stories that I know are there, I remember, but and it almost always brings them up quickly. So that's something, in other words, you have to make an effort to get educated, and then I think you need to make an effort to inform other people. That may sound a little like Don Quixote, but I think we got to do the best we can to prevent World War III from starting.
Roberto, I have a concrete suggestion based on the other side of that coin that is that come with us to editorial board meetings with our newspapers, and we'll help turn them around, because we have a very Russophobic news media here in the state, as you know.
Especially New Mexico.
Yes, and so we'll work. We'll work together. Yeah. Thank you. Any other? Yeah. Yes, Bill.
Hi, my name's Bill. Thank you for those presentations. This question's for Steve. You mentioned Stefan Banderas and the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. What role do they play in the government in Ukraine, and how much power do they have, and what's the situation now with the neo-Nazis?
Well, the far right was always prominent in Ukraine even before there was the 2014 coup. Stepan Bandera was a Ukrainian who worked with the Nazis during World War II, and among other things, they killed, I don't know, 100,000 Poles. It wasn't just Russians they were after. But there's torchlight parades, and I found an article, I can send a link to Greg. It was on a Jewish website, and it's called, it was about Ukrainian Nazi monuments that have been erected, and it shows that since 2014, almost every week there's been 1 or 2 monuments erected to Stepan Bandera. Streets renamed, this is while they're taking down the Russian monuments. But, I mean, there was the Azov battalion too, that was, if you look at their insignias, they were a separate military group that was incorporated in the Ukrainian army when the war began, after the war began, and they also came to play a role of kind of supervising other brigades. It's sort of like the minders that the Russians had, the Soviet Union had during World War II, at the beginning at least. It's something that's been kind of dismissed in the Western press, that, oh, there's no Nazis there. But if you look, there's a history of articles about neo-Nazis in Ukraine up until around, I don't know, 2014, in mainstream media even. And I've got a list of those too I can send to Greg, but I don't know if that answers your question, but the Russians, if you look at their main goals, their stated goals for their wars, denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. So they're pretty convinced that there's plenty of Nazis there. I don't want to go on about it too long, but I think there's a great deal of evidence that shows that that's the case.
Bill, I'd like to answer that also. One of the lead negotiators for Ukraine in the Istanbul peace talks was found shot dead on the street after almost coming to a peace agreement with Russia. When Zelensky was elected, he was elected on a peace platform. So Poroshenko was really genocidal. His campaign speeches were, our children will thrive, they'll be in schools, their children are going to cower in basements because we're going to shell them and kill them in Donbass. So Zelensky ran on a peace platform. But when he got into power, the very powerful right-wing forces of the right sector, Azov Battalion, all of these formations, not just one, but there's several, made it very clear that if he wanted to survive and his government wanted to survive, he had to change his line completely. The far-right violent groups were the muscle that behind the coup d'etat in 2014. So they shot people, a lot of people, on both sides from the protesters' side of the protests. And as a result of that, they moved right into government and took over powerful ministries, the security ministry. They still are powerful in the armed forces. They shoot deserters. They were protected by Zaluzhny, the head of the Ukrainian armed forces. They weren't sent far forward as often as the conscripts. They were kept back because it was thought necessary by Zaluzhny, who was identified with these people, close to them, to keep an ideological group intact so that no matter what would happen, the far-right ideology would survive. So now there's, and if you look at our Ukraine page today, Ukrainian press has publicizing an analysis of why the Ukrainian army is losing, why people are moving back so fast. Well, Styrsky, the new head, finds that the Azov battalion people don't think of themselves as regular soldiers that will go to the front and obey orders. They're used to being back, and they don't want to be regular soldiers. This was the analysis yesterday, I think, by Bernard of Moon, Alabama. Ukrainian government is permeated with neo-Nazis. have textbooks for the children, monuments, you know, little children's textbooks. When I grow up, I'm going to get my dagger, I'm going to go to Moscow, I'm going to kill Russians. And this is taught in schools. And so there's a problem there, and it's related to the willingness of Ukraine to do these terrorist attacks, like the Crocus City Hall. They're not operating from the same rule book. And that I attribute to the heavy influence of the neo-Nazi formations in Ukraine, which I should say the CIA has nurtured since World War II. Ukraine was really the only country that wasn't denazified after World War II. The early CIA brought in the entire the German Nazi intelligence on the Eastern Front, the Galen's organization, and made it a major cornerstone of the new CIA. So we were used to working with these Nazis. We protected them. We brought a lot of them to Canada especially. And they were our boys, and they've been our boys for 8 decades.
I have a question about the term Nazi. I think there's some confusion because we all think of it as anti-Semitic. But is it not true that the Ukrainians also have this pride in being pure Europeans, and they look at the Asian mixture in Russia as making them an impure race? So it's not a purely anti-Semitic thing. Is that
That's
correct?
right. That's right. Beletsky, the right sector founder, famously made a speech that it was the role of Ukraine in the modern world to purge, let's see, what did he say? To be the vanguards of the white race and purge the impurities. Blah, blah, blah. I can't think of it right now.
The Nazis had a term for the inferior races called the Untermenschen, or the under people. And so it wasn't just Jews, it was Gypsies and Russians and anybody that weren't the pure Aryan bloodline. You know, somebody can actually be a Nazi and still be Jewish, for that matter, because it's an ideology. Although they might not have survived in Nazi Germany, but they seem to do pretty well in Ukraine today.
Well, let me see. So, where are we? Let me see if I can kind of. We covered whether Steve did whether the invasion was unprovoked or not. I think that often when we talk among ourselves, we try to imagine what it would be like if a very large NATO-equipped and highly trained-up army was located just south of the border or just north of the U.S. border in Canada. Would we tolerate this? And they were shelling us. Would we tolerate it?
Suppose it's called the North American Treaty Organization, and it was all the Central American states and Mexico.
Right. The Ukraine, at its closest point, is about 300 miles from Moscow. And so this is like North Carolina to Washington, D.C. And when Steve spoke of, and I think Peter also, the danger of U.S. missile bases in Romania and Poland, and then possibly in Ukraine as well, and in the future being equipped with very high-speed missiles, this means the elimination of any reaction time for Russia. So Putin said, and people say, oh, he's making a threat. No, he's speaking factually. He said, this is a dagger at our heart.
It's a 5-minute flight time from, with a hypersonic missile from the Romanian base to Moscow. So yeah, would we like that if we had one on Lake Superior that could hit Washington, D.C. in 5 minutes?
No way, Jose. We would not tolerate it in a million years. And neither should have Vladimir Putin. And one thing that he's a man who is responsible for the welfare of the Russian people. And so if I was him, would I have tolerated that? Given the history?
when the Mark 41 launchers hit those ballistic missile defense sites, they're loaded with missiles that come in a container where the observer can't tell what is in it. And they're dual use. They can also be used to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles, as well as interceptor missiles. And cruise missiles are particularly they're hard to intercept. So that was another concern of the Russians. So well, how do we know what you're loading into those? That's the reason why they specified that those bases had to be removed in their 1991 draft treaties 2021 draft treaties they proposed. Sorry to interrupt you, Greg.
No, that's fine. It's good. Well, the most important thing that, I could add a lot of stuff here, but I want to be sure and have time for the implications of this for arms control, disarmament, which are really back-footed now to preventing nuclear war. So we're back where we were in the 80s, let's say. We had a luxury of talking about disarmament at one point in time, but with everything that we have done, the Russians now have a word for us, which is not agreement capable. It's a single long Russian word. And we're structurally incapable of keeping our word. And it's partly because of the way our political system works, with leaders that change every 4 years, and it's partly because of very long tendencies in the West, which we've now educated Russia, still exist. So most of the nuclear weapons in the world are in the United States and Russian hands, so about 89% or something like that. So to have a prayer of nuclear disarmament or to prevent nuclear war, we need to make peace with Russia more or less job one. And as Trish has put it, failure to centralize the need for peace with Russia on the part of the disarmament and arms control movement is just irresponsible. That it's just evading the biggest elephant in the room. And we know that this is going to take some time. They're not going to jump back into some arms control agreement just to see the U.S. walk out of it again. They've been burned too many times. Now here's a thesis which I'm going to leave on the table because I can't really, I'm not sure that I know enough to really defend it, but the geopoliticians the neocons have thought of Russia as China's back door. China would be easier to take care of if we took care of Russia first. I think that the reverse is also true, that peace with Russia will make peace with China a lot easier. Russia's the big nuclear power, and it's, so I think, now this is a thesis I'm going to put out there, that to progress and to prevent nuclear war, I think we need to accept some realities, 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how we count. The first is that we need to abandon the idea of the U.S. The rules-based international order, which is a euphemism for U.S. hegemony and other countries doing what we want. These rules are rules that the U.S. chooses and changes as needed. The rules-based order is something that stands against international law and against the UN system of sovereign states. Russia has made enormous diplomatic advances by pointing this out to the third world. Russia says, do you want to be in a quasi-colonial situation vis-a-vis the United States, or do you want to be a fully sovereign country? We're fighting for you. And this is persuasive to many former colonies. We're going to have to accept defeat in Ukraine. We are facing defeat in Ukraine despite everything that's happened, no matter how many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died on our behalf. But Russia, this war is existential for Russia. They will not be defeated. It's not existential for the people of the United States or the people of Europe. It is existential for an uncontrolled Wall Street elite and for the stockholders of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. They will lose a lot of money. So we have a problem here, and this is sort of a fly in the ointment of the realist school of foreign policy, where people, states do what's in their advantage. In our case, our state is doing what is to the advantage of a very narrow slice of people at the top. It is not in our advantage to be cultivating war with Russia. I want to read from a military writer in Utah, Will Shriver. He seems to be a veteran who writes music, but he writes pretty well. We've thrown everything we can at Ukraine, just about. It hasn't worked. We see around us the deindustrialization of this country. We can't do things too well anymore. And his final paragraph in a recent column was, in its hubris-fueled determination to prove it could do what no Western hegemon had been able to accomplish over the past 5 centuries, the rapidly eroding Anglo-American empire will now be compelled to swallow the bitter pill of decisive strategic defeat on the same Eastern European steppes where its predecessors were served their own banquet of consequences. Now, this is not going to happen, this acceptance is not going to happen under Biden. Biden is desperate to string this out so he can get elected again, or somebody in his group. But we will find some way to euphemize this reality. And I am encouraging the arms control and disarmament movement to accept it. Basically, let's accept not having an empire. Let's accept our weaknesses and invest in our own country, in the jobs. We've had to drive up and down East Central Avenue in Albuquerque quite a lot the last few days, and I'm sick of what we have on our streets and what we're not doing. The alternative, as Steve kind of hinted, if we keep pressing, if we keep imagining that we are incredibly mighty and that Russia can be broken, and keep pushing harder and harder and taking away options which we should be extending, we're going to find ourselves in a nuclear war very quickly. And because we are actually the weak one here. Fighting Russia in its own backyard was very stupid. I don't know what happened. Tricia and I could see this 5 miles away, for crying out loud. What's that saying, that amateurs do tactics, professionals do logistics? Their supply lines are very short. The other thing we need to accept is that economically we're in a lot of trouble now. And we need to focus on our own people. And we can't do that and be running one war in Eastern Europe and planning another one in the Indo-Pacific against a country which has already outclassed us in the rate of military production and in industrial production generally. And in specific technologies like hypersonic weapons. Russia has hypersonic weapons, China has hypersonic weapons. We've invested in aircraft carrier groups which will be on the seafloor in an hour if China or Russia want to do that. The negative consequence of our economic situation as we read it is we see in the absence, the difficulty that our young people have in even stabilizing their lives. So we don't see a lot of young people, a whole ton of them, in these circles because they're just trying to find an affordable place to live, find a decent job, get some health care. It's all very, very hard now. And this we think will get more difficult, so that the early 80s, which some who are in the commanding heights of the arms control and disarmament field would like to recreate, let's have another 2 million people in Central Park. We were wealthy in the early 80s as a country compared to what we are now. And people do not have the hope or the surplus in their lives to invest in things that are that far away from the immediate needs of themselves and their families. So the downside is that we're not going to have something like, we're not going to have a single issue movement that changes the government the way we did in, let's say, well, in fact, if we changed Gorbachev changed Reagan. Reagan wasn't as moved as Gorbachev was. The positive consequence is that these economic changes are going to compel changes in our national government. As those of you who have been reading what we send out think, that we've observed in Washington a decline in democratic oversight of the military-industrial complex and nuclear weapons in particular. Michael Glennon says we have a double government, and the institutions that were created by Truman have overwhelmed the institutions that were created by James Madison and the other people who wrote the Constitution. So and even the GAO, senior people have told me that they don't see much oversight in Congress since 2008. And so, but when things can't go on any longer, they won't. And so there will be in February 1st, I guess it was, a senior GAO person said to me when I asked, are they going to get all these weapons that they want? She said, absolutely not. This deficit problem is very real. They're going to have to prioritize. And she's not a dove. And of course, we can count climate change as another one of these things, and resource depletion, or we can incorporate them as part of the economic crisis. So you can count them separately or count them together, but they are big and they are going to change everything. So I think that as a first step to preventing nuclear war and to revitalizing arms control and disarmament, we need to foster a greater sense of reality and try to pull our brothers and sisters out of this Washington, D.C. based echo chamber built up by propaganda, which has Russophobia as one of its core operating principles, and a sense of rules-based order as its paradigm, and recognize that that everything has really changed now. That there's been a military defeat in Ukraine, and that there is a moral and legal defeat in Gaza and Palestine, and also a military defeat. And that the United States, by allying itself with Israel in that case, has taken on board a major diplomatic defeat that won't be easily fixed, if it can be fixed. And that we need, I kind of scolded a State Department person at a meeting in Washington. I said, can't we do something besides this self-righteous scolding of people around the world? How is that working out for you? And we have to get beyond that. And I'm afraid this scolding, this You know, Steve gets scolded if he is realistic. We get scolded if we're realistic. And I guess, let's see, I can count, hold on. There were 1,470 Google hits that combined the phrases Arms Control Association and rules-based international order. There were about 550 that combined the Arms Control Association and unprovoked attack or unprovoked aggression. These kind of phrases have become the shibboleths which define an in-group that controls the debate even on the progressive left. And this block, this solid block, can be and must be educated so that we aren't just a cheering section for the military-industrial complex.
Both sides, basically you have Prigozhin, who's Jewish, who's backing the neo-Nazi Wagner, the lead military guy, Wagner, he has like a Nazi, was it a tattoo or something? And then you got Kolomoisky on the Ukrainian side who runs the Azov battalion, or who did, I guess he was purged, 1 or 2 years ago or something. But this new Ukraine project, basically, don't remember the names of the individuals, but is essentially, the idea was to make Ukraine a homeland for Jews or whatever. Basically, the idea is like they're going to partition off Ukraine, and I don't know if anyone remembers at the beginning of the war, there's a leak from the Belarus, Lukashenko was like discussing, and interesting, like the exact same, this is not cool, just too strange of a coincidence, the exact same partition planned by Lukashenko was the exact same one by this Jewish organization of Ukraine. It's called the New Ukraine Project. I do remember that, which I find also pretty interesting. Then now, in addition, you've got, what's also strange is you've got these, ironically, the people who everybody calls the anti-Semitic military intelligence hardliners in Russia who oppose Putin, and same thing in the West, they're the ones who are ironically kind of like most, they're now like the more, in some ways more progressive, like the French extreme right military people backed the yellow vest from the very beginning. I don't know how many people know that, but it's true. I just find that very bizarre that the progressives in the, are now backing the stuff the Nazis did, like 100 years ago. Now the Nazis are backing the stuff that progressives backed as recently as 20 years, even 10 years ago. It's like, I mean, someone who, I have distant relatives who apparently were killed by the Banderites in Ukraine, and also were forced out even earlier. And it's really just wild. I just cannot fathom what's actually happening, but it's as if like it's some sort of like, we're living in like George Carlin or somebody in the heavens is like writing some sort of like irony or something happening, or like where everything's just, it doesn't make any sense, but that's what's happening. Yeah, these hardline military, like they're demanding we need free speech, we need to stop the wars, like all this progressive. Again, it doesn't make any sense at this point, but I guess that's what's happening. So yeah.
Peter, do you have any comments on that? You have a longer historical perspective than I do. You do.
I couldn't make any sense out of that, I'm sorry. I'd have to read it to follow exactly what he was saying. But there is one point that I would like to make that I didn't get a chance to, that nobody else has fully picked up on. And that is this idea that is proliferating that Putin's appetites are insatiable. That Putin is out to minimally recreate the old Soviet empire and maximally to take over the world. It's the same kinds of demonization and the same kind of attribution of grandiosity that we've seen in vilifying, demonizing leaders for a long time. And if we look at what Stoltenberg is saying, and we look at what Biden is saying, and we look at what Austin is saying, and we look at what Petraeus is saying. I mean, all the experts in the West keep saying that if we don't stop Putin, and he's going to keep on going. And now, I'm not as optimistic as you are, Greg, that the U.S. is going to be defeated in Ukraine. What I fear is that a year from now, we're going to be revisiting this subject, and there'll still be a meat grinder on the battlefield. There'll still be, maybe Russia will make some gains, but we'll still be at a stalemate, and there'll be 500,000 more people in Russian Ukraine wounded and killed. So I don't see the West exactly, and especially now with Johnson's new plan, which is to break up the funding bill and to break it into pieces and bring it to the floor. I'm afraid that a lot of that aid, maybe not 60 billion, but a big chunk of that will very likely get voted for Ukraine. And I see this thing just going on. And it's kind of a nightmare scenario for me. The real nightmare scenario, of course, is the threat of nuclear war. And that becomes more and more real and more possible every day that this continues. So what we're missing in the world now is diplomacy. And I'm part of a group now that is trying to get to Guterres, the Pope, Lula, and other international leaders who are trying to speak for the planet instead of their own parochial national interests, so we can restore some modicum of diplomacy, because clearly what's going on in the United States and NATO is the saliency and the domination of warmongers who are looking for military solutions to all these problems at a time when those solutions clearly don't exist. So that's a little bit I wanted to say, but I didn't quite follow what that fellow was saying about the new Ukraine project and the Jews who supposedly are involved with it.
David, I just want to say I saw a couple of headlines. I didn't read the articles. I don't know either, but I am observing that I have not, since I was an engineer, not a history major, there were other times in history like that Peter knows about and more, the Russian Revolution, when there were a lot of groups, there was a lot of chaos, and I think that in the United States we can expect very strange alignments going forward and a lot of unsettled things going forward.
What I'm saying though is basically common knowledge among Ukrainian and Russian dissidents. Everybody knows about it in those countries. It's not conspiracy theory at all. And I read some stuff about that, like the Jewish Azov Alliance in the Daily Forward, Global Research. I've read, this was Jewish Telegraph Agency report that there were actually Azov command people led by the IDF in 2014 from the beginning. Right. This is not some sort of insane, and there's actually collusion between the Russian and Ukrainian intelligence. And Putin just recently fired a guy from the Russian Security Council who said, for saying that Chabad is a Jewish supremacist organization. Putin fired that guy like a couple of months ago. I mean, that was,
there's, yes. Circles within circles.
Yes. Greg, Steve's got his hand up.
Oh, Steve. Yes, you.
Yeah, I just had a couple
Be careful.
things that Peter made me think of.
Yeah.
One time when Putin was accused of wanting to expand Russia, he said, well, Russia's 11 time zones. Why do I have enough territory as it is? And if you fly from New York City to Honolulu, that's 5 time zones. That gives you an idea of how big Russia is. So the desire for more territory doesn't necessarily conform with the problems that Russia already has with trying to keep their country together. And the other thing in regard to the $61 billion bill that's been bandied about for a long time in Congress, I heard a breakdown on that, on what the expenses were going to go to by, I think it was Larry Johnson last day or so, and he said almost all of it except for $6 or $8 billion is going to go to U.S. arms manufacturers for contracts for weapons. None of these weapons are going to be delivered any sooner than 6 months to 1 to 2 years. Whether or not Ukraine still exists at that point is a question. So, Kiev gets like 6 or 8 billion out of that, and I guess that's, to keep their government going, because we're paying all of the salaries for everybody there, pensions, everything else. So that's just a comment on, and in terms of money that's spent, the $112 billion we've already given to Ukraine is the equivalent of the total annual budget for 14 American states. And I mean, so it's not, you mentioned about driving downtown and looking at all the human wreckage that's littering the streets, and it's almost like that in every major U.S. city now. We have a few problems here in the United States that we could address with the money that's, being borrowed to give away to Ukraine. Our national debt's going up $1 trillion every 100 days, so I actually think that's unsustainable. We can print unlimited amounts of money, but at some point people are going to refuse to accept it for goods and services. And that might include China and Russia and the countries that produce industrial goods that we use. Okay, so those were my comments.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, hello, my name is David, and thank you very much for this very informative panel. I very much appreciate hearing everyone. What I'm thinking about, there's a lot of talk here about what we have to do. And what I've been observing is that it seems like a lot of that is regressing in some way rather than progressing. It's kind of not happening. So the world is kind of watching. And they're doing a lot of talk about multipolarity. They're talking a lot about, this BRICS alliance. What are some of your thoughts on that? It seems like the world is kind of taking their hands in this because maybe we're not really doing it here. Some of us are, but it seems like a majority is not. And they're kind of, well, we got to do something. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on multipolarity. And, there's these other things they're talking about with BRICS, forming other things to kind of go against the dollar. What are some of your thoughts on that? Thank you.
You want to take that, Steve? Or you want
Sure. Well, I have a few comments. There's a school of thought that says that one of the goals of the United States was to destroy the economy of Europe. Germany's being deindustrialized right now because their whole industrial base was highly dependent on cheap Russian energy and gas. And now they're buying liquid natural gas from the U.S. is like 4 to 5 times the price they're paying from Russia. And the U.S. apparently blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, at least according to Seymour Hersh. So in effect, what's happening is we've got a new Cold War, a new Iron Curtain that's going to isolate the Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and Australia from the rest of the world. They call it the global majority in some places. The new Silk Road that China's building is going to use high-speed rail that will go all the way across China. It will connect. What it does is it effectively will eventually eliminate the need for China to use the high seas to transport its goods. And that's what the U.S. Navy does, and the British Navy before it was to rule the high seas, and therefore you could rule commerce. The U.S. has 0 miles of high-speed rail. China has something like 40 to 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, and part of it's the U.S. is also funding terrorist groups to blow up this infrastructure project in places like Pakistan. They're targeting Chinese engineers. These are things you don't hear about in our news, but I think the end result is going to be that we're going to be we're going to be in bad shape because we are deindustrialized. We're highly dependent on, like China, for example, for rare earths and our pharmaceuticals. Hopefully we will reindustrialize at some point, but we're not going to remain the #1 power we won't remain in any power if we wind up in a war with Russia.
This is part of the strategic defeat that it's not just a little defeat. It's what we're doing now is really harming ourselves. And in my perspective, and in a way that is sort of on a multi-century level. And the rise of multipolarity is the exact opposite of the American century that was promoted by Henry Lucid during World War II. And it's very close to what Henry Wallace, yes, promoted instead, the century of the common man. And so what we're seeing is the belated growth of a different idea than the American century, or the unipolar moment, or the unipolar era. And we just can't afford this anymore. It's not working out for our country at all. More?
I just have one actionable thing.
Yeah.
I just want to hear your take on.
Gentlemen, I understand there's at least one, if not two, bills or resolutions. The one I know about is HR 7264, which is the Stop Politicians Profiting from War. It's Rashida Tlaib's bill. I think there's another one that's being rumbled about in Senate. What do you think, is that sort of delusional that that could possibly get passed? I mean, they're talking about the insane amount of profits that our elected officials make from sitting on war panels and being able to vote on whether those contracts happen, and then the next day collecting massive paychecks on them. Is that actionable, and is that something we could work on?
Good question. Anybody want to take that?
Sure, I'll take part of it. What I suggest you look at is the 1935 hearings of the Nye Committee in the Senate. Gerald Nye was a senator from North Dakota, and they had front-page headline hearings that went on for weeks, proposing a bill that, in the event of war, they either nationalize the so-called defense industry, or they tax it at 99% rate everything over $10,000 that they earn. Now, this was a reaction to World War I, because in World War I, which was very unpopular by the 1930s, the merchants of war, as they were called at the time, the merchants of death, made vast profits. And so it was the bankers and the munitions makers, and there was a huge public outcry about that, which even Roosevelt came to support. And finally, it falls apart, but there was tremendous pressure and support for national legislation to tax all the profits away from the war manufacturers. And that kind of movement could be galvanized again, and it came very close to succeeding in the mid-1930s, although it's almost completely unknown about even historians, let alone the American public.
I guess I would like to add to that. Yes, I think that all such measures that are so good should be supported. Our problem is that we're not in a good position democratically. I mean, our democracy is extremely flawed. And so now this is the point where I'm getting a little rebellious. We have to be more radical than we have been. We can't count on the Republican process, the small r Republican processes of government, our representative government, to handle things the way they might have in the 1970s, and it's we're in a different world, and that's why we here at the study group, when the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, for some of us this was the last straw. We want Biden and his gang out of there, they're out of control. Steve Starr made the comment at the time, if they're willing to blow up a piece of infrastructure critical for the economy of their largest European ally, what are they not capable of? Well, it's a frightening question, and I can't find anything. So we have to be thinking, we have to work in the system, but we also have to work outside the system, I think.
Steve has his hand up.
Steve, yeah.
Yeah, well, first I just want to compliment Peter on what a great historian he is. I never heard of that. That's a remarkable historical fact about those hearings. And it brought to mind the fact that in Russia, the military industrial complex, their defense industry is owned and controlled by the government. So, they spend 10% of what the United States does, but they have surpassed us. When we told Putin in 2007 and 8 that, go to hell, we're going to go ahead and build the BMD system in Romania and Poland, and you can do whatever you want. The response was an asymmetrical response where they developed hypersonic weapons, they developed electronic warfare capabilities, and air defense systems that are all far surpass anything that we have right now, which is an effect, and they are also an industrial nation. We're deindustrialized, so there was an article called The Industrialization of Warfare by the Royal United Service Institute a couple of years ago that just showed that the West is going to be completely incapable of keeping up with the Russian production of missiles and artillery shells. And here we are today. I don't know if Peter's familiar with all that. I might recommend that article to him just because I think that's what's happening on the battlefield right now, and it's tilting the favor towards Russia. But so I'm wandering around with my answer, but I like what Peter said about that committee, and I think the fact that the Russians have in a sense done what was suggested back then is the reason why they're, even with 10% of our military budget, they surpassed us and in all these areas of technology.
This Russi study that Steve mentions, I want to return to the thesis that Ukraine has lost. Basically, Ukrainian civil servants are paid with money from the U.S. and Western Europe. Their industry is in the dumps. Demographically, they've lost a large fraction of their productive population. They no
longer have an electric grid. John Helmer's writing about that on Dances with Bears column. There's only 20% of the electric generation capacity and distribution system that remains in Ukraine right now, which is going to shorten the war considerably.
So, Russia was holding all the cards, and Ukraine is sort of a basket case, and that's why the 60 billion is so important. The reports that Ukrainian lawmakers have developed their exit plans, how to get the hell out, which I'd be tempted to do too. So, it's a strange phenomenon. If we weren't supporting them, they would have. If we weren't controlling the situation and forbidding them to make peace, they would have done that a long time ago. And they'd been forced to do it. So that's what's so strange about the present situation. We're propping them up and preventing them from acting in their own self-interest, in my perspective. Last minute comments from anybody, from our speakers or from the audience, because we are approaching our 2-hour mark.
So we don't want to get into capitalism or anything like that?
Um,
Were we gonna talk about pit production?
We could talk about, maybe we should say 2 minutes for pit production. So this comes down to the nuclear weapons complex. And this Russophobia and the need, the threat inflation that Peter was talking about is what is driving Los Alamos and its transformation from a research facility to a production agency. And what is causing them to have recently hired a net 5,000 more people. As they say in their speeches, it's the equivalent of adding a whole other national laboratory. And very few people in Santa Fe understand this. They wonder, where's all the new housing? Why can't we find a place to live? Well, the lab director says 40% of the new housing is going to lab employees, and in Santa Fe. So, and the same thing's happening in Kansas City, where there was just a protest. People were arrested because the Kansas City plant, which makes most of the parts for warheads, not the nuclear components, but the non-nuclear components, has had to double its size. And they're working 24/7. Los Alamos is working 24/7. Pantex in Texas, which assembles nuclear weapons, is working 24/7 also. This is all being driven by this threat inflation, and the recent Congressional Strategic Posture Commission says none of this is anywhere near enough. Peter will be interested in, I'll have to send this to him later, but I attended a talk from a guy that says we've got to use those old pits to make a new generation of tactical nuclear weapons because we don't have enough cruise missiles, so we'll be able to use them more economically if we just get build quickly a whole bunch of tactical nuclear weapons so we can attack those tactical targets, especially in China because there's so many targets.
You mentioned the bipartisan Congressional U.S. Strategic Posture Commission report. And that is very, very important because what they're proposing, as you're saying, for the United States, is to reverse the decline in the number of nuclear weapons and dramatically increase the number of nuclear weapons, as we see going on now in China, in Britain, and in many other countries. So the world is going the wrong direction when it comes to nuclear armaments.
So I just wanted to make a quick comment here with what Greg was saying about the influx of what's happening in Kansas City, in Los Alamos, Santa Fe, at Pentex with the number of employees and the housing and everything that goes on. There's something that I think that certainly our government leaders are not thinking about, because this is going to end. And when it does, it's going to leave a giant gap in the economy of all of the cities that are associated with this, because this is a transient population. They will disappear. There will be this housing. There will be a hole in the economy that there is nothing to fill, because at least in New Mexico, everybody seems to think that the lab is going to save us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Yes, and this comes back to the practical questions. Sometimes it's easy, even in our field, to realize that all these activities actually take place in a physical location, in a geographical location, and there are actual people who are impacted by this. So, and we have a special opportunity because of that as well. Okay, Tricia's giving me the sign.
Can I make a little comment?
Yes, please.
Greg, I'm going to take off. Let me say goodbye to everybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much. Get some rest for your next 15 interviews.
Yeah, back in the 70s, I was in the Carpenters Union. I was an apprentice. I worked at Rocky Flats. And we were building a facility. It was supposed to be a $1 billion facility by one of the world's biggest contractors, Loomis. And it was massive. We would watch every day. It was 900 tradespeople working on this. It was an army marching in every morning to build this facility. And on the other side of it, we were not in the pit production area. There was a fence. But I would see periodically people suited up, marching to dig up barrels that were leaking plutonium, and traces were found in Broomfield, which is the closest suburb. And I don't know whatever happened to that long term, but my understanding is I met somebody who lived in Broomfield. They said it's all buried.
It is.
They just covered over the whole facility down. Anyway, if they start doing that here, I mean, I don't know if they're going to ship it to waste, to WIP, I mean, the waste, and
As Werner von Braun said, that's not my department. The rocket goes up where it comes down, that's not my department, said Werner von Braun.
Well, thank you.
Tom Lear.
Yeah. Thank you all very much for coming, and I know everyone has a lot of demands on their time, and really, really appreciate it. And if you want to work more on these issues, talk to Giovanna. Shane is also in the back there, and they can help you get started. And Lindy is right there as well. We've been doing experiments and outreach. I should say that many of you have been involved in anti-nuclear activism in the region for a long time. And the reason the United States does not have a working pit production facility is because of the work of people in this region and others. And it's a, we'll see what happens, but anyway, thank you all, and we'll see you again.
Shut them down.